stage now, and this is my first discourse, so make sure and give me plenty of hell in the Q&A afterwards. I want to start out by thanking CJ for putting this whole event together each month. Without him, there wouldn't be a discourse. And also thank you to Dr. Lack and UCO for letting us use the venue. Tonight, I want to talk mostly in two parts. First about the community, and secondly, I'm going to take it to an individual level about how we can build bridges and find common ground between the atheist community and other groups within, our local community, and so on and so forth. Those of you that may know me know that I use a lot of disclaimers whenever I make arguments, mostly to try and communicate more effectively, and tonight will be no different. So to start out with a few, the first being that whenever I began working on this talk, I had played around with some titles that had to do with positive atheism and being a positive atheist. However, upon researching that topic, positive atheism actually has a very specific meaning that I was not aware of, which is the idea that you're a hard atheist or that there's absolutely no God. And this talk is not actually about that. This talk, nor is it about atheism plus. It's actually about trying to be more positive. Secondly, I want to say that we are not all the same. This is a very large group, and there are a lot of people with a lot of different goals and a lot of different preferences and a lot of different ideas and how this group should function and what they want out of this group and what they think the atheist community should be doing. And tonight, I'm not trying to make any argument against any specific ideas. I'm mostly trying to make an argument for a middle ground, which is actually more difficult than I originally intended whenever I set out to do this. And thirdly, I am not a psychologist, nor am I trained in any sort of psychology. I do use a few studies that I will try and explain to the best of my ability and the relevance to the topic at hand. However, if I screw it up, I give Dr. Lack full permission to take me out back afterwards and show me the business.
The science business.
The science business. So, let's get started. You can't really go anywhere these days on the internet without coming across some sort of debate. In fact, there are people who are willing to argue about just about anything on the internet. And the whole concept of the way that our interconnected society has changed the way in which we communicate could be the topic of its very own discourse. However, tonight I want to bracket a lot of that and focus in on a very small subset of this culture that my Christian friends lovingly refer to as internet atheists. And I'm sure a lot of us have probably been an internet atheist at some point in time. I know I certainly have. You commonly see long wall posts of tons of facts or maybe a web meme or something along those lines. And of course, I also want to note that the opposite, internet Christians, also exist. However, usually with a few less colorful expletives. And I think that there is another very key difference between these two subsets of internet culture and communication, and that is public opinion. You see, atheists have been pretty marginalized for a long, the last few thousand years, as Christianity and other religions have had monopoly on control of the public sphere. And in fact, in a recent Gallup poll, you can see down here at the bottom, this is a poll of the willingness to vote for particular candidates of various beliefs and characteristics. And atheists are way down here at the bottom, where it actually says, I was surprised that 49% were actually willing to vote for an atheist, but of course 49% are also not willing to vote for an atheist. And that's unfortunate. However, of course, electability is not the end-all descriptor of our position in society. And so I want to come to this other study that was actually done at the UBC with the University of Oregon that had to do with what actually drives the prejudice against atheists. And basically, they did a study that exploited what's known as the conjunction fallacy. And for those of you that don't know, the conjunction fallacy is where they basically take a proposition, or they take a situation, and then they take, well, I'll just walk through what happened is they would take a proposition, like say there's a wallet on the sidewalk that has some cash in it, and an individual walks by and picks up the wallet and takes the money out and puts the wallet back. And then asks if it is more likely that the person who took the wallet is a teacher, or a teacher and a Christian, or a teacher and an atheist. And probabilistically, the answer is always the first option, because you are only matching one characteristic. However, they use this to try and measure our bias against certain groups, because oftentimes, if we ascribe, say, the behavior of stealing to a certain community, like, say, atheists, then you would be more likely to answer the second option, because the way our mind works, that just seems more likely to us, even though probabilistically it's not the case. And whenever they did this study, we actually ranked way up there with rapists, which is also pretty unfortunate. And of course, we also often reinforce this very negative stereotype that we have. In fact, in a recent interview with The Sun magazine, Sam Harris actually said if he had the option to get rid of rape or religion, he would choose to get rid of religion. And I think whenever we have people in the public sphere representing atheism, this is sort of a step in the wrong direction. And of course, at this point, the next obvious question is, why does it matter what people actually think about atheists? That's a valid question. And my answer would be this graph. I'm sure a lot of us have heard of this recent Pew poll data about the rise of the nuns. In fact, there was a recent piece on CBS about that Red did a wonderful job of putting together and working on. But what struck me as very interesting about this graph and about the whole topic at hand is that we're talking about nuns. We're talking about people that don't particularly have any sort of religion. We're not talking about atheists, and we're not really talking about agnostics, because if you look at the graph, the nuns have gone up quite a bit in the last little bit, but agnostics are sort of, kind of coming up there. Atheists are almost flatlined. And so, of course, the reason why we should be worried about our public image is because these people in the nothing in particular category also share many other common goals with us that, like on social issues and things like that. That's also in the Pew data that they did research on. And in fact, I say a few years ago, for a while I would have considered myself one of these nuns. And if I can step back for a second and tell a little story about how Christy and I came to find the AOK. You see, I lost my faith whenever I was in my teenage years. And that was really about it. I never really thought much about, I figured there was no God, but I never really thought much about identifying with a particular ideology or a particular crowd, let alone atheism. It was just sort of, something about me, and I went along my business. Until one day, my lovely wife, Christy, happened upon the AOK and said she was planning on going to a meetup with a local atheist group. And I thought that kind of strange, because what does an atheist group actually do? Okay, are we supposed to sit around and scheme the best way to, fight the war on Christmas? Or, excuse me, Xmas, sorry. Do we sit around and argue about which one of the 4 horsemen is our favorite? Personally, I'm still pulling for Bennett, just so you know. And so the point is that the idea of being a part of a group of atheists, even though I had rejected the idea of God, was completely foreign to me. It was something that had never crossed my mind. And so if we're going to appeal to some of these people that are in that category, we're going to have to do a better job of representing our group and what our actual goals are. And at this point, a lot of you who have been in the community for a while may realize that we're heading towards what seems to be a pretty dirty word in the community for the last few years, and that would be accommodationism. And just a poll of hands, who here has heard accommodationism or seen the debate? Okay, so a few people. The Rational Wiki defines accommodationism as the idea that atheists can find common ground with those who also believe in the spiritual worldview. And before we get too far into this, I'm going to have a few more disclaimers just to get out of the way. First off, I want to make it very clear that I am not a fan of creationism, even less so young Earth creationism. If we have school books that say things like the stars were put so far away by God because he never meant for us to travel there, that is terrible. This is not the sort of thing that I would ever say that we should try and accommodate. Secondly, kind of tying to the first, there are truly cases in which religion does terrible things. And I think that we should obviously stand against those things and fight those situations whenever they arrive. And lastly, I'm all for scientific skepticism. You're not going to see me tiptoeing around, homeopathy and that sort of thing. So with those out of the way, I hope to come back to the discussion on accommodationism, which, what I said before, mostly had to do with the idea of finding common ground. And in the history of this debate, it seems like there are two very clear sides. There's the people in the community who believe that, well, there's this more liberal religion and we can just kind of get along with that and just kind of let the other stuff go under the rug. And then, of course, there is the other side who believes that we should absolutely eliminate religion from every corner of society, and until such a thing happens, then we won't stop commenting on our blogs. But tonight, I want to say that I don't think it's that clear-cut. That I think that there are very specific situations when religion is truly harmful, and those are the ones that we should be attacking. And then there are also times whenever it's okay, whenever we can find common purpose to serve with religious groups, or with any sort of community group, really, though most of them in our particular area in the United States happen to be religious. But I think that the idea that there is only one of two options is not exactly clear, or is not exactly true. And you could say I've been called radical about being moderate. But the idea is basically that we don't have to be one or the other. We can be one some of the time and the other at a different point in time. And one of the things that I want to draw, or one of the other community movements that we can learn from would be, and one of the ones that I read a lot about, was the coming out campaign of the gay rights movement, whereas we also had the out campaign of the atheists. However, there's a big difference between the two, in that the coming out campaign seemed to focus much more on similarities between people in the gay community and the community at large. When it was advertised that these people are your mechanics and your doctors and your teachers, whereas it seems in the atheist community, it is focused much more on differences, and that we're out and we're atheists and we're going to comment on all of your Facebook statuses and post a whole bunch of web memes, which I'm not talking, it's okay to post web memes and to comment. But I think that the focus of our campaign about being out has kind of gone off track. And part of this, I think, I want to set aside for now and focus on one thing that speaks much more to me than the accommodationism and the idea, and focus in on working together. And the reason I want to focus on this is there was a study known as the Robbers Cave study that was done back in the 50s by an individual named Muzafir Sharif, and I'm sure I'm absolutely destroying that name. But it was done in the 50s. It was actually here in Oklahoma at Robbers Cave. And what he did was he took about 22, if I recall correctly, adolescent or preteen boys. They were 11 and 12, and he tried to get them to be as identical as possible, you know, for all intents and purposes, similar interests, similar backgrounds, similar builds, that sort of thing. And he took them and he split them into groups at the summer camp. And at first they didn't know that the other group existed. However, throughout the camp, they began to work on goals that, you know, either one group or the other group could win. And so effectively, he took these individuals who were, for all intents and purposes, identical, and formed these in-out group relations between the two. And then at the end of this study, he tried to reintegrate the two groups who, you know, like I said, most of the individuals were actually pretty similar, and actually had a lot of trouble with this. And first off, I want to start by saying the study is not perfectly analogous to our situation, since the atheist community obviously is much smaller and has a less of a standing in the community than, you know, the religious, as I showed earlier. And so, you know, we're not exactly on the same playing field, and obviously we're a lot different from the religious community. But the things that I wanted to pull from the study and that I found most interesting actually had to do with the fact that whenever he tried to reintegrate them, actually getting the individuals from each group to hang out was not enough to lower tensions between the groups, or to make the groups more likely to integrate and to, you know, like each other. And what did make the difference was to actually work on a common goal, was to get both groups to force cooperation and get them to work on some sort of, you know, objective that they had to work together on. And this really stood out to me because I think that if we want to actually build bridges and connect our community to the greater local community, we are going to have to find things that we agree on and to work together on. And if you take nothing else from this talk tonight, and the main central core argument that I want to make tonight is that given atheism and the rejection of the spiritual world and the afterlife and everything else, that puts a very strong emphasis on the very short life that we have. And it also puts a lot of value on the lives of those around us. And so I think that if we're going to focus on something, it should be on doing good and affecting real change within our community. And an added side benefit of that is going to be interfacing with other groups and, you know, building up our group and its status within the local community. And thankfully, AOK, and one of the reasons why Christy and I stuck with the AOK, and I really love being a part of it, we already do some of these things. One of which would be the food bank. How many here have been to the food bank? Just quick. It's an awesome meetup. I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. And actually, when you volunteer at the food bank, we often volunteer with a variety of other groups, Christian groups, professional organizations. And I've had some of the most candid conversations with Christians at the food bank meetups. You know, where somebody asks like a really simple question about, because oftentimes, you know, I'll wear my AOK t-shirt, or I know some other people have the Friendly Neighborhood Atheist t-shirt that they wear. And you know, so people will realize that the AOK is working there, and will ask these really, you know, in-kind, really nice questions about, so what do you think happens after you die, or whatever. And I think that's really where we need to connect. I say a lot that the people have to change before the politics will change. And the same is true, I think, for public opinion. That if we are really going to develop our standing in society, that we're going to have to work on developing individual relationships. And secondly, we used to do a lot of walks for charity. We haven't done any recently, and but that should change. And that's another way that we can, you know, get out there and do some good. And lastly, Americans United for Separation of Church and State is another really good local group that actually has some churches that are involved in it and work on, you know, separation of church and state and those sorts of things. And so, like I said, if I want you to remember one thing from tonight, it's that do some good. And if you have ideas, please bring them forward, and, you know, let's get involved with the local community. So to sum up the community section, which is what I've been talking about so far, I would say that first off, what I was just talking about, let's do some good, let's build a better local community, let's get our community involved with doing that. And through that process, we can help mitigate the negative ideas that a lot of people have about atheists and about the atheist community. And along the way, we may be able to pick up some of the nuts, hopefully. And then also we can, being involved in the community is obviously very important, and interfacing with more groups. And I guess I kind of already mentioned the growth, getting some of the nods along the way, and be the change that you want to see. If we're more friendly, we'll get more friends. And that's pretty much it for the community section. I want to, in this second part, really focus in on some things that we can do as individuals to try and foster an environment that helps build these sorts of relationships. And the first one, which is also the most difficult, is, of course, communication. And, of course, we're going to start out with a few more disclaimers, which, first off, I want to say I'm mostly talking about a mutual communication wherein, it's not a hostile interaction, like you're talking to somebody who's actually willing to listen to you and you are actually willing to listen to the other person. And secondly, like I said before, this is actually probably one of the most difficult. I have a very hard time even communicating sometimes with people who I feel like I communicate very well with. And some of the ways that you can work on getting better at communication, the first one being listen. Ask questions. Really try and gain an understanding of the person that you're talking to, with the individual and their ideas that they're trying to share. Because it seems like most of the time, people are talking past each other. And this is especially difficult online. There's a lot of talking past each other going on online, which is kind of unfortunate. But that would be the first thing. It would be listening, and really listening with understanding, and really paying attention to what people are saying. And secondly, don't marginalize people with your language. Like, don't come into the conversation assuming that we are in separate groups, but we don't need to make that apparent with our language. And I find oftentimes that if you start out trying to connect, then oftentimes you do a better job of communicating your ideas and them actually understanding your ideas. And the number one way that I see this is definitely the us versus them. That happens a lot. Don't forget that we are all human. We all, have very similar interests. We all like breathing, for instance. And lastly, as a member of an atheist community who's very pro-science and everything, sometimes it's hard to forget, and I'm totally guilty of this, that we do not have all of the answers. As much as we do know, and as much as we have learned, especially in the last 100 years, there is still a lot that we don't know. And that's okay. That's part of what makes life and science so amazing, is the fact that we don't know. And that kind of brings me to my second part about how to interact better as individuals. And I want to bring up a term that I first heard a few years ago called enchanted naturalism. And in fact, I would absolutely love to do an entire talk just on enchanted naturalism. I first came across the topic from a blog called Common Sense Atheism. I don't know how many people have read it. It's by an individual named Luke Malhauser. And basically, enchanted naturalism is a much more positive view and much less nihilistic. Because a lot of times we get painted as very negative people being atheists. We're all about no gods and none of this and all of that stuff. And so I think it's important to focus on more of the positives. And in fact, if you don't read XKCD, you probably should be reading XKCD. So that's the second thing you should get from this talk, is read XKCD. And here we see our friendly hatted fellow talking to his nihilist buddy and trying to really get him down, but he's decided to befriend some squirrels in a tree. And this is kind of an example of what I'm talking about. I really like this cartoon because the future is an adventure. And science is an adventure. And there's so much in this world that we don't know that we should really have the market on awe. We should really have the market on amazing things. And this, I think, this I think is what we really should be focusing on. You know, getting rid of religion, if that's the right way to phrase it, or marginalizing some of the bad things that religion does, is what often gets the spotlight. However, tonight, I really want to argue that more of us need to be talking about this. And if you need any ideas or examples of it, there are tons. There are so many, it's not even funny. Like, for instance, the light that falls on the earth is actually thousands, if not hundreds of thousands years old from the nuclear reactions going on inside of the star that we are currently orbiting that we call the sun. Is actually, like I said, hundreds of thousands of years old. That's pretty amazing. Like, that the photon that is actually illuminating our world is thousands of years old. And secondly, we are at a point in human history where we are actually using pulsars to try and measure gravitational waves. Like, that's pretty amazing too. And thirdly, even if you just think about the human eye, or the eye of any vertebrate really, and how complex it is and how amazing it is that it works. Any one of these things are important for trying to be more positive. And I think if, honestly, the second thing that you could pull from this talk that I hope that you remember is just generally being more positive and trying to push for more positivity within our community. So in closing, I want to kind of sum up that basically my central argument is that the world already has a bad enough opinion of atheists just because we've been marginalized for the last several thousand years, that I feel like that we should be working more on trying to better our standing in society, and we should be doing that by working together with other community groups. And I think through doing that, it will help us grow, and it will also help us build a better society, which is obviously a good goal. And I will leave you with a quote that I actually lifted from my friend's Facebook page. And I guess basically he's making a similar argument about the skeptical movement, that the us versus them mentality and the idea that we're always right and we have all the answers is not particularly constructive. And I guess with that, I will open it to questions.
Can we clap now?
Sure.